Hey, what's up guys? Brian from Zombie Guitar here. This lesson is going to be on diminished chords and specifically how you would go about incorporating diminished chords into songs or chord progressions. Okay, so this lesson is going to be divided into three parts. The first part, I'm going to go over four different diminished chord shapes that you could use. Some of them are a little tricky to play, but they're not too bad. The second part of the lesson is I'm going to give you a trick on how to quickly locate a diminished chord in any position you happen to be playing at. And then the third part, we're going to actually go about implementing diminished chords into diatonic chord progressions. Okay, so there are three different types of diminished chords. Okay, you have a diminished triad, you have a half diminished chord, and you have a full diminished chord. Okay, so a diminished triad is simply just a root, a minor third, and a diminished fifth. Okay, so a major triad would be a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth. A minor triad would be a root, a minor third, and a perfect fifth. A diminished triad is very similar to a minor chord in that it has a root and a minor third, but it also has a diminished fifth, meaning that the fifth is 1/2 step lower than that of a minor chord. Okay, so let's first take a look at what a diminished triad would look and sound like. So let's use C for all of our examples. Okay, all of these shapes that I'm going to be using are going to be rooted on the A string. Okay, so let's find the C. C is right here, 3rd fret, A string. Alright, so we're going to take our root. Alright, and then generally the way that this chord is played is in this particular order. So you take your root, then your diminished fifth. So if it was just a fifth, it would be like this, which is a power chord, but you take the fifth and 1/2 step lower is a diminished fifth, so you have, okay, and then locating the minor third. So if this was a C minor chord, this note right here on the B string is what makes the chord minor. Okay, so that's a minor third right there. So you have your root, you have your diminished fifth, and you have your minor third. Okay, and then you want to mute out the G string in between. So that is a diminished triad. Now if you wanted to make that into a half diminished chord, you would add a seventh into this chord shape, okay? And it would be a flattened seventh actually, okay? So a flat seventh is the note that is 1 whole step below the root. So our root in this case is C. So a flat seventh would be found the note B flat. So we want to somehow go about trying to add this B flat into this diminished triad. So we have this diminished triad so far, which is, okay, so B flat, you have another B flat here on the G string. Okay, so we can make our diminished, or we can make our half diminished chord like so. Okay, so that is a C half diminished. Okay, that's also known as a C minor 7 flat 5. Okay, because essentially this is a C minor chord, and it's a C minor 7 chord, and it has that flattened fifth. Okay, so C half diminished, also known as C minor 7 flat 5. Okay, so the other diminished chord that we could use is a full diminished chord. Now a full diminished chord again has that diminished triad, but the seventh is double flattened. Okay, it's flattened by 1 more half step than that of a half diminished chord. So we already figured out that our flat 7 was the B flat. So lowering that 1 more half step, you come down to this note, B. Okay, so a full diminished chord would look like this. All right, so sometimes a little tricky. Okay, so that's a C diminished chord. All right, and these chords are movable. You can play them anywhere. All right, so you have your diminished triad. then you have your half diminished chord, and then you have your full diminished chord. All right. So those are your three shapes, and they are movable. And you can play this anywhere, all right? You can play, no matter what your root is, you can play this anywhere. So if you were to take your root and put it on the 7th fret, and then you wanted to play an E diminished triad, okay, or an E half diminished, or E full diminished. All right, so those are your three shapes. Now, another one that is can be substituted in place of power chords would be simply just taking the root and then the diminished fifth. Okay, so instead of doing a power chord like, okay, which is a root and a fifth, you could just kind of take your root, lower that fifth by 1/2 step to make it the diminished fifth. Okay, and then add in your root again on the G string. So it's root, diminished fifth, root. Okay, and you could also play that same, I guess you could call this a diminished power chord, okay? I don't know if that's the exact name for it, but it's a root, diminished fifth, root. You could also play this on the E string. So essentially you have four shapes. You have your diminished triad, your half diminished, your full diminished, and then you have this diminished power chord thingy, okay, which is kind of just a simplified version. All right. So with that said, let me get on to part 2 of this lesson. Okay, now in this part, I'm going to show you a little trick in which you can quickly locate a full diminished chord no matter where you happen to be playing on the fretboard. There's always a full diminished chord right nearby that's going to work in the specific situation that you're looking for it to work in. Okay, now the thing about full diminished chords is this chord right here. We started out on our it was a C full diminished chord we used. That chord is the exact same chord as this chord, which is exactly 3 frets up. So here our lowest note of this chord is on the 3rd fret. So if you move that up 3 frets, 1, 2, 3, that's the same chord. And then if you move it up 3 more frets, 1, 2, 3, and then if you move it up 3 more frets, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. Same chord, okay? It's the same exact 4 notes, it's just rearranged differently. So when you play it here, you're playing the same 4 notes as here, except the notes are just in a different order, okay? So that's the cool thing about full diminished chords, okay? Now this, you can also verify this. There's another way of looking at full diminished chords. You can look at them in a arpeggio type fashion in which it spans a larger area of the fretboard, okay? So again, let's just start out on our note C. We're going to start out on our low E string here. So here's your note C. Okay, your next note is going to be here, which is 3 frets higher. Okay, and then you're going to move to your A string and you're going to shift that a fret up, so it's okay. So those are your 4 notes of your full diminished chord. All right, and then if you wanted to keep moving across all the strings, you would go. You'd move to the D string and then up a fret again, because that's the same thing that you just played on the E string. So it's okay, and then if you wanted to move to the next string, the G string, you would move to the G string and then you would move up a fret again, because it's the same thing you just played on the A string. So you have, alright, and then when you get to the B string, because the B string is that weird string where everything's kind of shifted a little bit, you have to now move 2 frets, okay? So it's 2 frets. Alright, and then you get to the E string, and then you shift up just 1 fret again. So this is a full diminished, the four notes of a full diminished chord, but in an arpeggio fashion. So, all right, and again, that same trick applies if you move down 3 frets or up 3 frets. Okay, so these four notes can be spanned across all 6 strings. Those same four notes can also be found here, and they can also span across all 6 strings. Okay, and then if you wanted to keep moving down, you could go to the 2nd fret and it would still be the same four notes. Alright, and you can verify that this is the case, okay? You can verify that those four notes are exactly the same four notes, but this trick just allows you to play it in different spots, okay? So you could either look at this full diminished chord in an arpeggio fashion and then move it up or down by the 3 frets, and it's still going to be the exact same thing, just a different rearrangement of the same four notes. Or you can go ahead and you can play your full diminished chord like this, and then move it 3 frets, same exact chord, just different rearrangement of notes, or here, or here, or here, or here. Okay, so that is essentially the trick, and that's going to help you to locate a diminished chord at any time, no matter where you're at. Okay, so with that said, let's get on to the third part of this lesson in which you're going to apply this stuff. Okay. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at how you might go about using diminished chords in a song or a chord progression. Alright, so generally, if you have a song or a chord progression, most of the chords, if not all the chords, are going to be within the same key. Okay, in other words, all of the chords are going to be diatonic to a key. Okay, obviously you can change keys and whatnot, and you can use out-of-key chords and stuff like that, but for the most part, let's say you have a chord progression in which all of the chords are diatonic, all right, and you want to try use some diminished chords in order to spice up your playing and make things sound more interesting. All right. So one very common and very useful way to do that is to insert diminished chords into chromatic spots that fall in between whole steps. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. So let's take the key of C major, for example. All right, in the key of C major, you have, in any major key, you have 3 major chords and you have 3 minor chords. Okay, so in the key of C major, your 1 chord is C. C major. Your 2 chord is D minor. Your 3 chord is E minor. Your 4 chord is F major. Your 5 chord is G major. Your 6 chord is A minor. Okay, so those are your 3 major and minor chords in that particular key. Major, minor, minor, major, major, and minor. Okay, so those are your 6 diatonic chords for the key of C major. Alright, those are the major and minor diatonic chords that you could use and you would pull from in order to create a song or chord progression in this particular key. Alright, now the diminished chords, if you wanted to use diminished chords in your chord progression, you would put them in the spots that are in between the whole steps. So for instance, in between the C major and the D minor, you might want to put a diminished chord right here, rooted on the 4th fret. Okay, so your diminished chord, your full diminished chord. Okay, so instead of just going from C major to D minor, you can go C major, okay, you see how that was a nice flow right from the C major to the D minor, from the 1 chord to the 2 chord. You could also use a diminished chord right in between the D minor and the E minor. So instead of just going So I just went from the D minor to the E minor to the F major, which are all diatonic chords. Right in that little area, that non-diatonic note area, I could throw in a diminished chord right there. So I could throw in okay? So diminished chords fall into the non-diatonic little gaps in between chords that are a whole space apart, or a whole step apart. All right? Now, in any diatonic key, there's always one naturally occurring diminished chord that is actually part of the key. All right? So the last couple examples I just gave you, those are non-diatonic diminished chords. Those are chords that are falling in between diatonic chords in a chromatic spot, okay? Non-diatonic to the key. But if we were to keep moving up, the 7 chord of any major key, okay, or the 2 chord of any minor key is always a naturally occurring diminished chord. If you're just looking at the triad, then it's a diminished triad. If you're looking at the 7th version of the chord, it's going to be a half diminished chord. Okay, so your 1 chord is C, 2 chord is D minor, 3 chord is E minor, 4 chord is F major, 5 chord is G major, 6 chord is A minor. Your 7 chord is going to be, if you're just looking at a triad, then it's going to be a diminished triad. Okay, and then your 1 chord is back at C major again. Okay, or if you wanted to look at this chord in its 7th form, then it's a half diminished chord. Okay, so you can use that, and that's not even throwing in any out of key stuff. Okay, so every major or minor key has a naturally occurring diminished triad or half diminished chord in it. Okay, so let me try and just come up with a few examples just on the fly here. I'm going to play some power chords here where I'm going A to F to C to G. Okay, so say I want to, every other time I do that, I kind of want to throw in a diminished chord, okay? So maybe right after the C chord, okay, instead of going from the C to the G, I could try going from a C chord and then just kind of moving up 1/2 step in a chromatic fashion. Now that 1/2 step up is not going to be in this key, but that's okay because anything that's not in the key, it's not a major chord, it's not a minor chord, but you can throw in a diminished chord there, okay? So let me try throwing in a full diminished chord right there. So let's hear how that sounds. I'll do that every other time. Okay, so kind of spices things up a little bit. Okay, so let me try another chord progression. Let me try maybe a happier sounding chord progression. So we'll take a 6/4, or I'm sorry, we'll take a 1-5-6-4 progression. Okay, that's a very common chord progression. Okay, 1-5-6-4 progression. Thousands of songs use that chord progression. All of those chords are perfectly diatonic to the key of C major. All right, so let's say I want to make things more interesting. Let's say I want to throw in a diminished chord right after the G. Okay, so right after the G chord, I want to throw in a diminished chord. Alright, so my diminished chord would fall right on the 4th fret, okay? A chromatic half step above the chord that I'm coming out of. Alright, so coming from the C. Alright, now I like to do all my diminished chord shapes with my root on the A string, alright? So the diminished chord right here, I want to try and find my nearest diminished chord, but that's a G sharp. There's a G sharp all the way up here. I don't really want to have to jump that far, but remember that trick. Okay, so you can always go use either this as my root, or I can use this as my root, or I can use this as my root, or I can use this as my root. Okay, remember from part 2. Alright, so instead of using the G sharp, I'm going to use the B as my root. Alright, so there's a B here. That's nice and close. Alright, and I'll make my full diminished chord out of that. Alright? So I'm going to do that right after the G. So. Okay, so that was, whatever, kind of a cheesy sounding chord progression, but you get the point. I was throwing in that diminished chord right after the G chord, okay, but instead of using the G sharp, which is the chromatic note right after the G, I found an alternative, okay, because I wanted to find my, an available diminished chord that I could use that was rooted on the A string. So instead of using this as my root, I used this as my root. Only I used it here. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did I choose to use a full diminished chord as opposed to a half diminished chord? Okay, I could have used a half diminished chord. I could have used a diminished triad. I could have used a diminished power chord, like I showed you. I could have used any of them. Whatever, the point was, I wanted to throw some sort of diminished chord in there, and, you know, I just wanted to let my ear decide what was best, okay? So the full diminished chord happened to work, okay? So I used this. Alright, I could have used this. I could have just used the triad. I could have used just the power chord. Okay? They're all so very similar to each other, alright? Technically, the diatonic chord in this case, since I'm going on the B here, alright, and the B is one note lower than the tonic note of this key, which is C, the in-key chord would be the half diminished chord, okay? So technically, I should have used half diminished. Alright, but I decided to use full diminished. Okay, and my original intent wasn't even to use a B diminished chord. My original intent was to use some sort of a G sharp chord, okay, because I was trying to come up with something that fell right after the G chord in this progression. Okay, so I was trying to come up with some sort of G sharp diminished chord, but instead of using the G sharp, I wanted to find another variation of a full diminished chord. Okay, so I could have used this as my root. I could have used this as my root. I could have used this as my root. I could have used this. I could have used this. Okay, the trick from part 2. So instead of using this, I decided to go with this note, which is the B. The B is also found here. Okay, I threw in my diminished chord in that area, and it worked. All right. So you can break some rules. All right. The big thing to take from this lesson, the important thing that I want you to take from this lesson is you can take any simple chord progression in which all your chords are completely diatonic to the key, and you can throw in diatonic chords into those whole step spaces in between diatonic chords. Okay, that's what I want you to take from this. So that's going to be it for diminished chords. There's lots of other uses for them. That's for a topic of later lessons, future lessons. But for today, I hope you were able to get some useful information out of this. All right, so if I left anything out, or if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. Thanks a lot.